He reaches out his hand of grace to lift us up from whatever may be paralyzing our lives, so that we can walk and jump and dance in newness of life before him. Worship has the potential to touch our hearts and transform our lives. Here at Glendale, we look at it as an opportunity for us to come to Jesus, to become like Jesus, and to overcome in Jesus. But it isn't always that way. Every so often, we leave church wondering what happened. Has that ever happened to you? Have you ever left a church service feeling as if you'd missed out on God? Feeling as hungry spiritually as when you first came in? Feeling as if you hadn't worshiped? Chances are it's happened to you. And when it did, how did you react? Perhaps you blamed the boring sermon or the lousy music, certainly not today, or the unfriendly people. But there is another side to this issue of worship that perhaps you haven't considered. And it has to do with you. That's because worship isn't just something that happens in church on Sabbath morning. Rather, worship has much more to do with how we live our lives. And so consequently this morning, I'd like to explore 3 aspects of the human life that form the basis of genuine Christian worship. And we find those aspects of life in the amazing encounter between Peter and Jesus on the Sea of Galilee. A story that I've entitled Coming to Jesus. Our story begins by the Sea of Galilee, as a crowd of 5,000 men and an uncounted number of women and children encircle Jesus in the aftermath of his latest miracle. Jesus had just taken 5 small loaves and 2 fish and had broken them again and again and again until everyone in that huge crowd of people had been fed. Nothing like this had ever happened to them before, and their minds were racing with excitement. Here is a man, they said to themselves, who can not only heal the sick, raise the dead, cast out demons, turn water into wine, but now we know he can even feed us forever. Can you imagine what it would be like to have a king like this? And so slowly but surely the word began to work its way through the crowd. Let's make Jesus our king. But Jesus wasn't interested in being their king. At least not in this sense. And so Matthew tells us that immediately Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side while he dismissed the crowd. And after he had dismissed them, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. And when evening came, he was there alone. Jesus dismissed the crowd because he hadn't left the majesty and glory of heaven to become an earthly king. That would have made no sense at all, because his kingdom was infinitely greater than any other, and his mission far more profound. But I want you to notice that Jesus didn't just dismiss the crowd. He sent his disciples away as well. Why? Perhaps it was because he knew that they were no different. You see, they too wanted to make Jesus their king because they desired the highest positions in his kingdom. And so Jesus sent them all away and climbed a lonely hill to commune with his Father. As our example, Jesus valued the first aspect of human life that forms the foundation of genuine Christian worship. And that is relationship. Even as the world, the fame and fortune of this world beckoned him, what mattered most to Jesus was his relationship with his Father. And consequently, I believe that what matters most to Jesus as he considers our worship is not the capability of our technology or the proficiency of our musicality or the eloquence of our oratory. Rather, what matters to Jesus as he considers our worship is the intimacy of our relationship with him. Worship comes from the Old English word worthship. You see it on the screen. The familiar term that jumps out at us is the word worth. And that's significant because what it suggests to us is that worship is the act of ascribing ultimate worth. Worship is the act of ascribing ultimate worth. Think about what that means for a moment. Worship requires everything that we have. In other words, we cannot truly worship God until we are willing to sacrifice everything else for him. In this sense, worship isn't just something that happens in church on Sabbath morning. Rather, it is something that manifests itself in the daily choices and decisions of our lives. When my wife, Rayanne, was still studying for her optometry degree in Chicago, she faced this very issue of worship when some of her exams fell on the Sabbath. Because she believed in God's command for us to honor his Sabbath, to rest from our labors on his holy day, she decided that she would not take her exams on the Sabbath. Thankfully, the school accommodated her religious convictions, because if it didn't, she was prepared to forfeit those exams and, if necessary, her career. In this sense, Ray Ann worshiped God by refusing to take her exams on the Sabbath, because in doing so, she was placing her ultimate worth in him. We live in a world that places ultimate worth in material wealth. A world that measures success in terms of fame and fortune. A world that says learning to love yourself is the greatest love of all. But Jesus said that if we wanted to follow him, we would have to deny ourselves and take up our crosses to follow him. He said that we should love the Lord our God with all our heart and mind and soul and strength. You see, friends, that's what it means to ascribe ultimate worth. That's what it takes to worship Jesus. But this is where we sometimes misunderstand. We think that if we worship Jesus, that we will never have to face storms. But Jesus wanted his disciples to realize what it took to follow him. He wanted them to understand what it meant to worship him. And so what did he do? He sent them away. But not just anywhere. Jesus sent his disciples straight into the middle of a raging storm. Do you think Jesus didn't know where he was sending his disciples that night? Friend, perhaps you're going through a storm in your life right now. Maybe you're crying out, Lord, why is this happening to me? I've given my heart to you. I've tried to obey you. Why have you sent me into this storm? Perhaps that's what the disciples were thinking as they struggled to keep their little boat afloat on that dark, stormy night. Through the seemingly endless hours, they battled that storm, bailing water as fast as they could, paddling with all their strength as those powerful waves crashed across their fragile little craft, threatening to sink it and to snatch their precious lives away. They were experienced fishermen who had weathered many storms, but this one was different. All their experience, all their knowledge, all their skills were insufficient to conquer this storm. And as the long, dreary hours went by, exhaustion set in, and hope began to fade. And finally, with their resources depleted, their bodies battered and their spirits broken, the disciples gave up. Laying their paddles down, they dropped their heads and prepared for the worst. They say it's always darkest just before the dawn. And ironically, that's what time it was. The Bible says it was during the fourth watch of the night, which means it was between 3 a.m. and 6 a.m. The darkest part of the night. Suddenly, a disciple's voice pierced the howling winds. "Someone's coming," he exclaimed. The disciples strained incredulously to see the lone figure walking toward them on the waves of the storm. Suddenly, another disciple blurted out what others were thinking. "It's a ghost," he cried. "Death is coming for us." And the disciples cowered in their boat. But in the moment of their greatest fear, the man on the water called out to them, saying, "Take courage. It is I. Don't be afraid." Friend, are you exhausted from fighting the storms in your life? Then allow me to remind you that it's always darkest just before the dawn. For in the darkest part of your night, when all hope is gone, when there's nothing more you can do, when there's nowhere else you can turn, look up. Because Jesus is there. And he says to you, "Take courage. It is I. Don't be afraid." But like so many of us sometimes, Peter wasn't quite sure that it was Jesus. And so he called out, "Lord, if it is you, tell me to come to you on the water." This brings us to the second aspect of human life that forms the foundation of Christian worship. And that is response. You see, worship never begins with us. Genuine Christian worship is always a response to the invitation of Jesus to come to him. He is the one who said, "Let the little children come to me, and do not forbid them, for such is the kingdom of heaven." He is the one who said, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." But when we respond to this incredible invitation of Jesus, The irony is that we often find ourselves called to do things that we never thought possible before, like walking on water. What is it that you've never had the courage to do for Christ? Where is it that you've never had the guts to go for God? Who is it that you've never had the nerve to talk to about Jesus? I was driving down the freeway one day when I encountered a question on a billboard that I have never forgotten. It asked, "What would you do for Jesus if you knew you could not fail?" What would you do for Jesus if you knew you could not fail? How would you answer that question, friend? You see, responding to God's call often means having the courage and faith to step out of our boat, to leave the comfort of our pews, to reach out from the privacy of our sheltered lives, to venture beyond the safety of our faith communities, and to walk on the stormy waters of life around us. That's what Peter did. And as the other disciples looked on in amazement and disbelief, he stepped out of the boat and began coming to Jesus. But the story doesn't end there. The Bible isn't clear about what happened next, but I imagine that suddenly a flash of lightning lit up the night sky. And for a moment, perhaps just for a second, Peter took his eyes off of Jesus to gaze at the frightening fury of the storm. And in that moment, he began to sink. And as the powerful waves engulfed him, he cried out, "Lord, save me! Lord, save me." Have you ever prayed that prayer before? I have. Lord, save me. When I was growing up, I used to hear preachers say that when Peter was walking on the water, he became proud. And so he looked back at the other disciples to see whether they were watching him. And that's why he began to sink. It sounds like a good story, except that that's not what my Bible says. You know what it says? Matthew 14, verse 30 says, "But when he saw the wind, he was afraid." In other words, it wasn't pride that caused Peter to sink, but rather fear. Isn't that true for most of us? When we're asked to serve the overwhelming needs of the world, when we're called to be a witness for Christ, when we're challenged to do something great for God, most of the time it isn't pride that holds us back, but rather fear. fear of the unknown, fear of our own inadequacies, fear of failure. Have you ever failed? Allow me to jog your memory for just a bit. Raise your hand if you've ever said something that you later regretted. Raise your hand if you've ever been rejected. Raise your hand if you've ever forgotten the birthday or anniversary of someone you loved. Raise your hand if you've ever sinned. Peter looked away from Jesus, saw the wind, became afraid, and began to sink. Did he fail? Of course he did. But by focusing on Peter's failure, we sometimes forget that there were 11 bigger failures sitting in the boat that night who never had the courage and faith to step out on the water and come to Jesus. You see, Peter's failure was public. It was embarrassing. It was humiliating. Theirs was private, unnoticed, uncriticized. But in the end, only Peter knew what it was like to walk on water. And only he knew what it felt like to feel the saving grasp of his master's hand. Yes, we have failed. Every one of us. But the moral of the story is not that Peter failed, but that Jesus saves. The Apostle Paul affirmed this for us in Romans 10, verse 13, when he quoted the Old Testament prophet Joel by saying, "For whoever calls on the name of the Lord will be saved." Friend, that's God's promise to you. If you will come to him. And as Jesus and Peter climbed back into the boat, the storm finally subsided. The wind ceased. The sea became calm again. And then in stunned amazement, the Bible says that the disciples worshiped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." You see, friend, when you discover God's wisdom, you learn from him. When you encounter his strength, you lean on him. When you experience his integrity, you trust him. But only when you have received his redemption can you truly worship him. This is the third aspect of Christian worship: redemption. Before you were saved, perhaps you were doing just fine in your little boat. Maybe you even called yourself a Christian. At least you acknowledged God, but you kept him at a safe distance, comfortably apart from your life. You knew that worship was important, but so was your career. So was your salary. So was your status in society. Then came the storm. The shock, the fear, the anger and darkness closed in around you like a fog. You were lost, and hope was fading fast. Where would you turn? Your career was powerless to stop the storm. Your salary couldn't buy you peace. Your status in society meant absolutely nothing in this crisis. And suddenly you realized that there was only one person who could save you. One answer, one hope, one God. You see, sometimes it takes a storm for us to see God. A storm that drives us to reaffirm our relationship with him. A storm that motivates our response to his call in our lives. A storm that ultimately makes us grateful for his redemption. And in the end, that is why we worship him. Friend, I don't know what storm you may be going through right now. But I do know this. Jesus is calling you to have the courage and faith to step out of your boat. He is calling you to walk on the stormy waters of life around you. But most of all, he is calling you to come to him. Because he has come to save you.